What's up, and welcome to my comparison performance analysis between the Zephyrus G15, the Strix G17, and the Scar 15. We're going to be looking at the technical specs between these devices. We're going to look at all the possible configurations you can buy briefly, not going into super details there, and then we're going to take a look at all the benchmarks I've accumulated for these three laptops. I've stuck them in a bunch of graphs, and you can see how they line up with each other, as well as how they compare with some of the other laptops that I've tested in the past. So we're going to go over all of these benchmarks. This is going to be a long and detailed video, so don't expect this to be super quick. If you want the quicker breakdown, just check out each individual laptop review, which I'll have linked in the video description down below. This is the technical specs breakdown between the Zephyrus G15, the Strix G17, and the Scar 15. Now we have the Ryzen 9 in all of these, but we have the HS model and the Zephyrus G15. This is a 35 watt TDP, where the HX is a 45 watt TDP from AMD. Now the thing is, all three of these laptops will push well above the TDP limit. So what really matters is the TDP that Asus sets for these CPUs. Now, TDP stands for thermal design power. If you don't know what that means, basically it's how much electricity can be pushed through the laptop at one point in time. And depending on the load, especially with dynamic boost, you might be able to push more or less through that CPU as the GPU takes part of the electricity from the laptop. Now, we have the RTX 3070 in the Zephyrus G15 and Strix G17. And the Scar 15 had the RTX 3080, so we're going to be able to see the differences between these devices. Now, we have the QHD displays on the Zephyrus G15 and the Scar 15, and we have a 300 Hz Full HD display on the Strix G17. Now, all of these come with FreeSync enabled through the AMD GPU. So basically, the way the video feed works on these laptops is the NVIDIA GPU renders the game frame, and it goes through the integrated GPU, and then it's displayed on the panel. And now, because the video feed goes through the integrated GPU, it does cause a CPU bottleneck, especially bad in some titles. But most titles, it doesn't matter that much. It will matter a lot more if you're trying to go for this 300 Hz refresh rate versus the QHD 165 Hz, simply because the QHD 165 Hz is going to be fairly easy to hit with the Scar 15 and Zephyrus G15 and a lot of the esports titles, whereas the 300 Hz, you're going to end up getting CPU bound oftentimes before that 300 frames per second mark, probably closer to like 200 or 250 or something like that in a lot of these games. So if you really want to get 300 Hz refresh rates and actually hit those frame rates in a lot of games, you'll want to get a laptop with a mux switch, or alternatively, you can use an external monitor on all three of these laptops to improve performance. And I'm going to go over some of those numbers as well in this benchmark comparison, so you can see the performance difference when you bypass this CPU bottleneck. Now, for the display's actual stats, we get 318 nits on the Zephyrus and 328 nits on the Scar 15. I believe these are like the same display because they both have 93% Adobe RGB. Now, the Strix G17 is, of course, a 17-inch display, and it's 355 nits, so it gets a bit brighter, but it doesn't have quite as high of a color gamut at 75% Adobe RGB. The Zephyrus G15 has 16 gigs of RAM, as well as the Strix G17, and they're all DDR4 3200 megahertz. But the thing is, one of the sticks is soldered on the Zephyrus G15. So what this means is that if you want to upgrade your memory to 32 gigs or 64 gigs, and you want to maintain dual channel throughout the whole experience, you're gonna need to get the Strix G17 or Scar 15, or you can get the more expensive version of the Zephyrus G15 that comes with 32 gigs out of the box. Now, one major downside of the Strix and Zephyrus G15 is that the RAM is slower than the 32 gig RAM that I tested in the Scar 15. So for memory sensitive games, as you'll see, we're going to get a little bit less performance there. Now, we have 1 terabyte PCIe SSDs in all of these, and they all have an extra M.2 slot available. Now, the biggest difference between these three devices is the weight that you get and the thickness of the laptop. So 4.33 pounds for the Zephyrus G15, 5.97 pounds for the Strix, and 5.07 pounds for the Scar. Now, I also want to point out with the Strix and the Scar that these are thicker machines that have higher TDPs, which we're about to get to in a second here, but they're not the highest performance TDPs. Like, there are 6.5 pound or 8 pound laptops that are quite a bit thicker, that have even better cooling and higher TDP limits. So, like, for example, the MSI GE76 is a higher performance, higher TDP limit laptop. Now, you have other laptops that are similar in size, but they just choose to run at a higher TDP and also run quite a bit hotter than the Strix and Scar here. So in theory, you could have gotten a little more performance if Asus had tuned them to be a little bit higher TDPs, but they didn't out of the box. And I kind of like the TDP that we got here because you do get great overall performance and temperatures at the 115 to 130 watt range, which we'll get to in a second here. Now, this is all of the Asus Strix Zephyrus laptops that are currently available for sale in North America, or at least the United States. So you can see there are lots of different versions of each of these. You have RTX 3060 versions of the Strix and Zephyrus lineup, and then you have RTX 3070 versions of the Scar, and you even have a Ryzen 7 5800H versions here. This is a tab here on my main spreadsheet. You can see my RTX 3000 spreadsheet right here, where you can compare all the different laptops that are currently available with RTX 3000. So since I added this tab, you're going to be able to go through and compare just these specific laptops together, and they're all going to be stacked on top of each other, so it's a lot easier to view and use them. So I'm pretty excited about this. I think you guys will find this to be very helpful when you're comparing these laptops. Let's go ahead and kick off this comparison by taking a look at the power limits of all three of these laptops. So you can see that when you're just using the GPU, you get 99.2 watts of power to the Zephyrus G15. That's quite good, but the Strix and Scar can both push up to about 130 watts. Now, you'll notice that the Scar 15 is averaging slightly higher TDPs in the CPU and GPU pretty much across the board, even though the Strix lineup is, in theory, should be the same. This may just be a difference in firmware. It's hard to know exactly why, but you'll also notice in the stress test, the Scar 15 does average a little higher temperatures and clock speeds as well compared to the Strix G17. So I guess it all makes sense and lines up, even though all three of these laptops were tested the same. And speaking of which, I test all these laptops the same. I do all the same prep. I update to the same drivers as best I can, or at least the latest drivers, the latest firmware. And then I test all of these laptops, unless I say otherwise, in manual fan mode with 100% fans and whatever default clock speed settings. And so that means that we're going to have increased performance slightly above just straight stock on all of these tests, but I test all the laptops I ever review this way, so that way everything is as consistent as possible. Taking a look at our CPU power limit, this is under a CPU only load, so this is when you're rendering a video in Hanbrake. We can push up to 60 watts of power in the Zephyrus G15, and the Scar and Strix G17, we're pushing close to 80 watts of power, not quite, but very, very close. Now, when we test the CPU and GPU under a dual load, so in this case, it's a dual load stress test with the Heaven benchmark and the Firestrike physics test running at the same time, you can see that the CPU pulls 48 rough watts of power in the Zephyrus, 54 watts of power with the ROG Strix, and 59.3 watts of power with the Scar 15. Again, this might just be a difference of firmware, and then for the GPU, you can see under a dual load, we got 74.7 watts of power with the Zephyrus G15, and then 114.9 with the Scar, and 111 with the Strix G17. I think the main thing to focus here on this graph is just recognizing that the TDP is quite a bit lower with the Zephyrus G15, particularly under a dual load. Being able to pull 115 watts of power versus 75 watts of power consistently is a big difference. Taking a look at our Timespy graphics score, we got 11,448 with the Scar, 10,800 with the Strix, and 9,498. So there is a noticeable gap between each laptop. There really isn't a huge difference between the 3070 and 3080 here. Now, the main reason for this is as you add more CUDA cores, you also need to increase the TDP if you want to see a massive performance difference. At least that's my current running theory, because basically as you add more CUDA cores, you can only run them at a lower clock speed and when you have the same level of TDP. So the end result is that you only get a small gain in performance. I think the biggest difference here is going to be your TDP. For example, if you have an Alienware M17 R4 that can push 150 to 165 watts of power, that's where you can get close to 12,500 and maybe even break the 13,000 mark. And it's the same 3080, it's just a higher TDP so you can push more performance. All right, so our Timespy points per pound, we can see that with the Scar 15, we are at the top, the pinnacle right here at 2258. But the Zephyrus G15 is not far behind, and that's pretty amazing to me because it's a 3070 versus a 3080. So now if you were to put a 3080 into the Zephyrus G15, you probably are going to pass the Scar 15 by at least a little bit. But like I said, there's not much of a performance gap between the 3070 and 3080 when it's at the same TDP level. And the Strix G17 is down lower. It's not as much performance per pound because it does weigh basically 6 pounds. Now, our Timespy points per dollar is really, really good on the Asus Strix G17, and that's because it's a thicker chassis and it's not priced as high. You're like basically paying for just like kind of the sweet spot of performance, I think. Maybe an RTX 3060 version of the Strix G17 for $1399 would beat this on performance per dollar. Probably would, but it'd be very close, I think. So the Scar 15, not great performance per dollar, but decent. And the Zephyrus G15 is still shockingly very good on the performance per dollar, despite being so thin and light. Moving on to the Cinebench R23 scores, you can see we both got over 13,000 for the Strix G17 and Scar 15, and we got 12,100 for the Zephyrus G15, and that shows you the difference in performance you can expect with the TDP difference here. And our single core scores are very similar, around 1450 for all three laptops. So know that you're not really sacrificing that much performance with the Zephyrus G15 because it still has a fairly high TDP despite being a much thinner laptop. So if you're really looking to pack a lot of CPU performance in your backpack for a lightweight, the Zephyrus G15 is really, really good. That said, I also am testing the Zephyrus G14, and that did basically the same level of performance as the Zephyrus G15, and that's in an even thinner and lighter pack. I'll have to revisit this comparison when the Zephyrus G14 is fully tested and reviewed, but for now, this is where we're at. And I think it just really goes to show you that we're packing some crazy levels of performance in these laptops that are super thin and light. And here's our Cinebench R20 score, all pretty close, but again, the Zephyrus G15 is a little bit behind. Now for our Cinebench R20 points per pound, you can see our Zephyrus G15 tops out the charts for laptop CPUs at 10,075. The Scar 15 is not too far behind, and the Strix G17 is kind of in the middle of the pack this time, being beat by some of last generation Ryzen processors. Now for our points per dollar Cinebench R20, you can see we got 2.89 on the Strix G17. This is close to the top for performance per dollar, despite it being an $1,800 machine. I think that's incredibly impressive. The Zephyrus G15 also is doing quite well. The Scar 15, not so great on points per dollar. You're kind of hitting, some diminishing returns with the increased premium features and RTX 3080 increase to the price tag. Now, for our Hanbrake 4K render time, you can see the Strix G17 and Scar 15 churned out very, very close on the timings at 7 minutes and 44 seconds and 7 minutes 56 seconds. And the Zephyrus G15, again, a bit slower in the CPU performance category, but not too far behind. You're talking, roughly a minute behind the Strix G17 for this render time. For our Heaven Bench stress test for the Strix G17, this is the best thermals of the three laptops. You can see that on maximum fans, we got 54.6 decibels of noise. Now, keep in mind that my ambient room noise out of the box is 40.5, or right around 40, okay? So very, very quiet for maximum fans. And then for the performance and turbo noise, we got 46 and 49. That's very, very good. And the temperatures as a whole were very, very good. Nothing went above 90, even under a dual load stress test. So 2 giant thumbs up. And most importantly, in the manual mode, we got 74 degrees Celsius for the GPU and 78 degrees Celsius for the CPU. So really good temperatures in manual mode, even under a dual load stress test. I think that's kind of insane. So you can see that we're getting some really good performance out of this machine in all the different modes, but even in silent mode, we're getting a basic level of performance that if you're going to play an older title or a title that's not as graphically demanding, or you only need 60 frames per second, you can run it in silent mode and still get a great performance in a lot of games. It's going to vary a lot from game to game, though. So let's go ahead and move on to the Asus Strix Scar 15. All right, so for performance, we got 44. Silent, we got 42.9, so just a little bit louder in the silent noise profile. And in turbofan noise and in manual mode, we got some pretty high numbers, a bit higher than with the Strix G17. But again, not bad. Like I would consider bad fan noise in max fans to be like 57, 58 decibels. So we're at 55, 54. That's still pretty good. But if you want a balance between performance and noise, it looks like the performance profile for the fans is the way to go for the Scar 15. So you can see that we're getting good temperatures in all of these modes except for the turbo fan mode. And this is because in turbo fan mode, we're able to see really good clock speed on the CPU. So moving on to the performance numbers here, you'll see that we got the best performance out of the CPU in turbofan mode because it was pushing a little bit higher TDP at 60.3 watts under this dual load stress test. So it's a really interesting and weird thing here that in manual mode, it goes down to basically 54 watts, and in turbo mode, it goes up to 60. And I saw something similar, I think, in the Zephyrus G15 as well. But you'll just notice that we're getting a bit higher clock speeds in addition to the increased temperatures on this Scar 15. You can also see that our clock speed on the GPU is not boosting as high. And again, this is because increasing the CUDA core count at the same TDP means we just can't boost as high. Now, when I did flash the BIOS, I did see around 1850, 1900 for the clock speed. So it really is just comes down to your TDP that you can run on the machine. But I have done quite a bit of gaming in silent mode when needed to be quiet, when someone's sleeping next to me, right as I'm using the laptop. And silent mode's been great. I've really enjoyed using silent mode on the Scar 15. And I'm sure that all of these laptops would perform quite well in silent mode, shockingly well, actually. So Zephyrus G15, you can see we get 42 on silent, 49 on performance, and 51.3 on turbo, 56.7 in manual. So what this means is we get to the loudest fans out of the three with Zephyrus G15, which makes sense, right? Because it's a thinner laptop. The air is just gonna not be quite as quiet as it comes out those fins. Now, you can see our temperatures here are actually still really, really good, a little bit better even than the Scar 15. And I think this comes down to the lower TDP limits that you get on the Zephyrus G15 and kind of balancing it with the reduced thermals that the laptop can put out. So taking a look at the clock speed here, you can see that we're getting significantly lower clock speeds on the GPU as well as the CPU. The CPU is not too far lower down here at 3.9 compared to the Strix G17. But still, overall, good performance from the Zephyrus G15 as well, and nice stable performance and no thermal throttling on any of these laptops except for the Scar 15 in turbo mode, where it kind of boosted too high and just couldn't maintain. Taking a look at our game benchmarks. Now, I've got all of the game benchmarks here. I'm going to go ahead and just let it play here, but this will give you an idea of performance in 1080p first, and then I also have two sets of 1440p, and then we're going to compare a bunch of these games, but feel free to pause here and just look at these benchmarks. If you have a specific game that you want to compare between these laptops, you can do that here as I move through these. So here's 1440p, and then we're going to get the 1440p for the Zephyrus G14. So you got all of these you can go through if you want later, but now we're going to go ahead and get into some comparisons. We're not going to compare every game though, so keep that in mind. Cyberpunk 2077 on Ultra, RTX enabled, DLSS. So this is like all tricked out. You can see we're getting the best performance from the 3080. So this is one of those games where Timespy doesn't really represent the real world performance, and I think that's related to the CUDA cores, the tensor count, and the architecture for Ampere just being more robust on the 3080, I guess, because it's just able to handle RTX and DLSS better than the 3070. You can see that we're getting notably more performance out of these three laptops than the MSI GS66 Stealth. And I think this is because of the increased TDP, again, compared to the Stealth. The Stealth maxes out at 95 watts compared to, the Zephyrus G15 can go to 100 watts. So we're only getting a little more performance. And then for the Strix G17, we can go up to 130 watts. So we're pushing 56. And all three of these have 3070s, right? So that's a pretty notable difference. And it falls right in line with what you'd expect given the TDP of the laptop. Now with the Scar 15, we're getting a notable improvement here up to 65 FPS. So just know that there is a bigger difference in RTX and DLSS titles. Don't know that this is going to carry out perfectly through all RTX and DLSS titles, but this is what we've got right now in Cyberpunk. All right, so here is Red Dead Redemption 2. We've got 81 FPS on the Scar 15, 77 FPS in the Strix G17, and 73 FPS on the Zephyrus G15. So really, really good performance again. And keep in mind that Cyberpunk and Red Dead are very GPU-bound games, and we're going to take a look at some CPU-bound games, and you'll see that these laptops don't perform quite as well in those CPU-bound games because they don't have that mux switch for the dedicated CPU increase in performance. So here's Watch Dogs Legion. You can see that in Ultra with RTX enabled and DLSS on quality, we get 62 FPS with the Scar 15. You can see the Zephyrus G15 is at the bottom of the pack at 52, but it's not a massive difference here, and the game is still going to be perfectly playable for you, even with all of the settings turned up. Now, keep in mind, this is all 1080p. All these benchmark comparisons are 1080p unless I note otherwise, and that's simply because I have more data for 1080p laptops than I do for QHD, though I will have the averages for 1080p and QHD here at the end. So just bear with me. Next up, we have Call of Duty Warzone. You can see that this is all done in the Battle Royale training mode on low, except for textures, which I keep on the highest settings. I would expect a 15 to 20% reduction in performance overall when you're in an actual match. So just keep that in mind. You can see that there is a difference in performance between these laptops, and also keep in mind that this game can be CPU bound depending on what area of the map you're in. All right, next up we have Far Cry 5. So we've got 110 FPS for the Scar 15, 105 for the Strix G17, and a rounding it out nice 5 FPS gap between each of these laptops, 100 for the G15. This is obviously really good performance. You're going to have a great time playing this game on any of these laptops, but when you compare this to last generation hardware, you can see that we're being beat by an RTX 2070, for example, with a 10750H. You know, basically 2 generations ago, the Strix lineup from 2 generations ago. And why is this? Well, first of all, number one, we don't have a mux switch on this laptop. Number 2, this is a memory-sensitive game, and we don't have the fastest memory in 2 of these laptops. Number 3, this is a CPU-bound game, and Intel sometimes just does better in certain titles. It just depends on the game. But this is the first better performance from potentially lower TDP or older generation hardware because of the CPU-bound nature of the game. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is going to be similar. We get 111 FPS from the Scar 15, which is pretty good, actually. I think it's good, but it's not as high as what you'd get if you had a mux switch. And so keep in mind, again, this is a very memory-sensitive game, and we're getting a big difference in performance here. Obviously, we have different hardware between these two, and I saw a noticeable, big improvement. I think it was around a 14% improvement in FPS when I just upgraded the memory on the Strix G17. I think it got up to about 110-ish FPS or something like that. Big difference, right? So just keep in mind that you can see improved performance if you upgrade the memory. If you want to check out that video, I'll leave a link in the description as well to the memory test that I did, swapping out the different kinds of memory for the Strix G17. And I think this is one big downside for the Zephyrus G15, is that if you want to upgrade the memory to a faster memory, you can only upgrade one of the slots. So I don't think you're going to see a noticeable performance increase without upgrading both of them. And because you can't upgrade both of them, you're just kind of stuck with the existing RAM speeds that you got. So kind of a bummer, but at least memory-sensitive games are not that common. Taking a look at CSGO on high settings in the workshop benchmark, you can see that we got 308 FPS on the Scar 15, 262 and 259 for the Zephyrus. So overall, this is obviously great performance. You're not going to be like, oh my God, the performance sucks, because you're getting great FPS, but it is less than what you can get if you bypass Optimus with an external display. Look at this jump. 308 FPS to 448 FPS on an external monitor. So if you really want to have 300 FPS constantly in CSGO, you're going to want to use a 300 hertz external monitor to hit that kind of frame rate. If you had a mux switch, you'd be able to get that kind of frame rate on the internal laptop monitor. But again, if you have a 165 hertz display like you do on the Zephyrus G15 or the Scar 15, what difference does it make? Anyway, not much of a difference really at all. Taking a look at Rainbow Six Siege, you can see we got 264 FPS on the Scar 15 on the internal display, but we got 334 FPS on an external display. So again, NVIDIA Optimus is holding us back, bottlenecking us. But again, you got to keep in mind our target frame rate is 165 hertz on these two laptops, which we're easily hitting. But on the Strix G17, we're not fully taking advantage of that 300 hertz display. If you really want to hit 300 hertz, you're going to have to lower some settings to be able to hit that. Taking a look at The Witcher 3, we can see we got 134 FPS for the Scar 15, 125 for the Strix G17, and 105 for the Zephyrus G15. So we have a nice linear pattern here between these three. Taking a look at the 1080p 15 game average here, you can see in our CPU bound games, we got 187 FPS on the Scar 15, 165 for the Strix, and 162 for the Zephyrus G15. Now for the GS66, we're getting great CPU bound game performance because it has a mux switch. That's where you're going to see the biggest performance gain. But you can see that in GPU bound games, the GS66 and Zephyrus G15 are like trading blows. They're very, very close for the GPU bound games. I think it's also important to note that the Strix G17 without a mux does still beat the GS66 that has a mux. So in GPU bound games, it shows you that the TDP of the laptop is more important than having a mux or not. Taking a look at the 1440p game benchmarks, you can see that we're getting 147 FPS on average for 1440p, which is not that big of a drop, right? Compared to 1080p, 187, go upgrade all the way to 1440p and goes down to 147. So CPU bound games, you're not looking at a huge drop in FPS. It's just going to depend a lot on the game. Now, for the Zephyrus G15, 126, still very good, still very playable for a lot of those games, and many of the esports titles are hitting above 165 hertz, even in 1440p. You can see right here that a lot of these games are hitting 165 FPS. These esports titles, it's just that we have some of these other CPU-bound games that are bringing our averages down. You can see that for our 1440p games, we have a big difference here between the Scar 15 and the Zephyrus G15, and I think part of that is because of the increased TDP to the CPU, and then we also have the faster memory, increasing some performance in those CPU-bound memory-sensitive games. And then in the GPU-bound games, we have a 9 FPS difference here between the Zephyrus G15 and the Scar 15. So not a massive gap in performance, but it's still there, right? So, and the weight difference right between these is only 0.7 pounds. So it's going to be up to you to decide whether you think that weight difference is really a big factor for you or not. Let's go ahead and move on to our speaker test. The Scar 15 pushes 85.6 decibels of noise through the speakers, and I think it has noticeably more bass. That said, the Zephyrus G15 is very close at 81.8 decibels. All three of the speakers sound pretty good on these laptops. I don't think you're going to really complain about the speakers on any of them. One thing I do want to make a note of is that with the Zephyrus G15, some of the speakers are up firing versus down firing on the Scar and Strix lineup. So if you're using the laptop in your lap a lot and just want to hear the audio a bit better, the up firing nature of the Zephyrus G15 speakers are going to provide a little bit better sound experience compared to using it on a desk where the Scar 15 is going to beat it out. Last but not least, we have our battery life comparisons, and we're getting very, very close to the same level of battery life on all three of these laptops. Interestingly enough, on my Scar 15, I got a little bit less battery life than on the Strix or the Zephyrus lineup. So I didn't quite understand exactly why that's the case. Maybe it's just due to the nature of the software I've installed, but I would expect to have pretty similar battery life between all three of these devices, but maybe a little bit less in the Scar lineup for some reason. I don't know why. So in the end, which of these three laptops should you choose? Well, if you want to get the most performance per dollar, you should go with the Strix G17 lineup because you're just getting more bang for the buck overall. But if you want to get a QHD display, you're going to have to go with the Zephyrus or Scar series. If you want the most portable machine and you really don't have to sacrifice that much performance to get it in the ballpark of 10 to 20%, you can get a super thin and light machine like the Zephyrus G15. I think another thing to keep in mind is the case temperatures between the Strix and the Scar being much better than the Zephyrus. The Zephyrus is a thinner laptop, while in the Strix series, like the under and the keyboard, it just tends to be a bit cooler to the touch. So if you're someone that really wants to have your keyboard be cool while you game, then I do recommend getting one of the thicker laptops. Overall, all three of these laptops are going to provide really good performance, in my opinion. You're going to have to make a trade-off between, do you want something that's thinner and more portable, or do you want something that's thicker and a little bit higher performance? And then when you're deciding between the Strix and the Scar series, I think the decision is more about how premium you want the laptop to be, all the extra premium features that you get. Not so much related to the performance side of things as much. That's kind of the way I think about it, at least. So again, there's a link in the video description down below to the RTX 3000 series laptop spreadsheet, as well as the Zephyrus and Strix all models compared. So go ahead and check those out if you want something to peruse when you're done with this video. So if you found this video helpful, please smash that like button. And if you want to see more of my videos in the future, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out. I'll see you in the next one. Brandon out. Huzzah.